Sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when we least expect them. A single act of courage can change everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our purpose. When warrior Eirik Thorsson pulled a girl from a burning hall, he thought he was simply saving a life. The maiden called herself Alva, and she seemed like any other survivor of the flames. But when her eyes began to glow, and she spoke in the ancient tongue of seers, Eirik realized this was no ordinary rescue. Alva was the last child of the Volr spirits, hidden among mortals since the old gods fell silent. Her rescue wasn't chance, it was destiny. Now both mortal enemies and mythical forces hunt them as they journey north toward a truth that could reshape the world. What happens when a warrior discovers his bloodline is bound to the gods themselves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before the flames would change his fate forever, Eirik Thorsson stood at the edge of his ancestral lands, watching the morning mist rise from the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants. At 42 winters, he had seen enough battles to know that peace was often just the space between wars. Yet something about this particular dawn felt different. The air carried a weight he couldn't name, as if the very stones beneath his feet were holding their breath. His calloused hands, scarred from decades of wielding sword and axe, now rested gently on the wooden rail of his longhouse porch. The structure itself told the story of his lineage. Massive oak beams carved with the protective runes his grandfather had etched during the great storms of his youth, when the old ways still held firm sway over the hearts of men. Each marking represented not just protection, but memory, binding the present to ancestors whose names were spoken with reverence around winter fires. The Thorsson bloodline ran deep in these northern lands. Eirik's great-grandfather had been among the first to settle this stretch of coastline, drawn by dreams the seers had interpreted as favorable omens. The family had prospered, not through conquest alone, but through wisdom, knowing when to fight and when to forge alliances, when to speak and when to listen to the whispers that came with the northern winds. His wife Astrid emerged from the house behind him, her movements carrying the grace of a woman who had learned to find beauty in the practical rhythms of daily life. 20 years of marriage had taught them to communicate in the subtle language of shared glances and comfortable silences. She approached with 2 wooden cups of warmed ale, steam curling upward like small prayers. "The dreams again?" she asked, settling beside him with the easy familiarity of someone who had shared countless mornings in exactly this way. Her voice held no judgment, only the gentle concern of a partner who had learned to read the subtle signs of her husband's troubled sleep. Eirik accepted the cup gratefully, letting its warmth seep into his palms. Not dreams exactly, more like memories that haven't happened yet. He paused, searching for words that might make sense of the strange visions that had been visiting him for weeks. "I see fire, Astrid. Great halls burning, people crying out. And always, there's something I'm supposed to find in the flames." She studied his profile, noting the way his jaw tightened when he spoke of the visions. In their years together, she had learned to trust his instincts, even when they led to paths she couldn't see. "The old women in the village speak of signs," she said carefully. Strange lights in the northern sky, animals behaving oddly, ships appearing on the horizon that vanish when approached. "Superstition," Eirik replied, but without conviction. In truth, he had noticed these things himself. The way his horses grew restless at sunset, how the ravens gathered in unusual numbers, calling to each other in patterns that seemed almost like conversation. The rational part of his mind, trained through years of military strategy, dismissed such observations. Yet another part, deeper and more ancient, recognized something stirring in the world that couldn't be explained by weather patterns or seasonal migration. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Leif Erikson, Eirik's closest friend since childhood, emerged from the morning mist astride his massive bay stallion. Where Eirik had grown into the steady strength of an oak, Leif embodied the restless energy of the wind itself, quick to laugh, quicker to fight, and possessed of an intuition for trouble that had saved both their lives more times than either cared to count. "Brother," Leif called out as he dismounted, using the term that had bound them since they were boys, learning to wield their first wooden practice swords. "I bring news from Ulfheim. Jarl Magnus requests your presence at tonight's feast. It seems our old friend has finally decided to announce his daughter's betrothal." Eirik set down his cup, immediately alert. Jarl Magnus ruled the largest settlement within 3 days' ride, and his political alliances could mean the difference between prosperity and conflict for all the smaller holdings in the region. More than that, Magnus had been like a second father to both men during their youth, taking them into his household when their own fathers had sailed west on raiding expeditions that stretched through entire seasons. "Which daughter?" Astrid asked, though from the careful way she posed the question, Eirik suspected she already knew. The Jarl had 3 daughters, but only one whose marriage would create ripples felt across the entire region. "Sigrid," Leif confirmed, and Eirik felt his stomach tighten. Sigrid was not only Magnus's eldest daughter, but also one of the most sought-after matches in the northern territories. Beautiful, intelligent, and trained in both the domestic arts and the subtle skills of negotiation that made her a valuable political ally. Her choice of husband would signal which way the winds of power would blow in the coming years. "And the fortunate man?" Eirik asked, though he suspected the answer would explain the growing tension he had sensed in recent weeks among the various Jarls and their ambitious sons. "Harald Bloodaxe's eldest son." "Eirik?" Leif's expression darkened as he spoke the name. Harald ruled the southern reaches with an iron fist, expanding his territory through a combination of military might and ruthless political maneuvering. An alliance between his family and Magnus would create a power block that could dominate the entire region, or spark the kind of conflict that turned neighbors into enemies and left burned settlements in its wake. Astrid reached for Eirik's hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that spoke of shared understanding. They both knew that such political maneuvering rarely left smaller holdings untouched. If Harald gained influence over Magnus, families like theirs, prosperous but not powerful enough to stand alone, would face impossible choices between submission and resistance. "There's more," Leif continued, lowering his voice despite the fact that they stood alone on Eirik's own land. "Word has reached me through channels I trust that Harald's acceptance of this betrothal came with certain conditions. He wants assurance that Magnus will support his claim to the High Kingship when old King Olaf finally answers the call to Valhalla." The implications hit Eirik like a physical blow. The current king was indeed aging, and his own sons had shown neither the wisdom nor the strength necessary to hold together the fragile alliance of Jarls that kept their lands peaceful. If Harald made a bid for supreme power, it would mean war, not the quick, decisive conflicts that settled territorial disputes, but the kind of grinding, generation-spanning warfare that left only ruins and bitter memories. Magnus agreed to this? Eirik asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. The Jarl was a good man, but he was also pragmatic. Faced with the choice between potential conflict with Harald now or inevitable conflict later, he would choose the path that offered his people the best chance of survival. "The announcement tonight will make it official," Leif confirmed. "But there are whispers that not everyone in Magnus's hall supports this alliance. Some of the older warriors remember when Harald was just another ambitious young Jarl before he began his march toward domination. They remember the promises he made and the promises he broke." Astrid stood, her movements sharp with the kind of decision-making that had drawn Eirik to her all those years ago. "Then we attend this feast," she said firmly. "We listen, we observe, and we stand with old friends for as long as we can." Eirik nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her words, even as he felt the weight of coming changes settling on his shoulders like snow that would not melt. In a few hours, they would ride to Ulfheim, share meat and mead with people they had known since childhood, and witness the forging of an alliance that might determine the fate of everyone they cared about. As he went inside to prepare for the journey, Eirik caught himself glancing once more toward the northern horizon. The strange dreams that had been troubling his sleep seemed somehow more urgent now, as if whatever force had been stirring in the hidden places of the world was finally ready to reveal itself. He shook his head, dismissing such thoughts as the product of an imagination made restless by political worries. By evening, he would understand how wrong he had been to dismiss those instincts. By evening, the carefully ordered world he had spent 4 decades learning to navigate would be reduced to ash and ember, and a girl with ancient eyes would look at him as if she had been waiting her entire life for him to find her in the flames. But for now, in the fading peace of this last ordinary morning, Eirik Thorsson gathered his family and prepared to ride toward a feast that would end in fire. Carrying with him no weapons save the ones he had always trusted, his strength, his honor, and the unshakable belief that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect, the great hall of Ulfheim blazed with warmth and light as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Oil lamps flickered along the carved wooden pillars, their flames dancing across the intricate Norse patterns that told the stories of Magnus's ancestors. The air thrummed with conversation, laughter, and the deep voices of men who had spent their lives earning the right to speak freely in the presence of their Jarl. Eirik stood near one of the massive hearths, watching the interplay of alliances and tensions that moved through the crowd like invisible currents. He had arrived with Astrid and Leif just as the formal announcements were beginning, and already he could sense the undercurrents of unease that ran beneath the surface celebration. Jarl Magnus commanded attention from the high table, his weathered face reflecting both pride and something that looked almost like resignation. "Friends," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "tonight we celebrate not just the joining of 2 hearts, but the forging of bonds that will bring peace to our lands for generations to come." The crowd raised their drinking horns, but Eirik noticed how some faces remained carefully neutral. These were men who remembered Harold from his younger days, before his reputation for ruthless ambition had spread across the northern territories like smoke from a green wood fire. Sigrid stood beside her father, beautiful in the way that made men forget their own names, but her eyes held a distance that spoke of duty rather than joy. At 19, she possessed both the grace of her mother and the sharp intelligence that had made Magnus one of the most respected leaders in the region. Yet tonight, she looked like a woman watching her own funeral pyre being built. The moment Harold's son Eirik stepped forward to claim his bride-to-be, a commotion arose from the kitchen areas behind the main hall. Shouts of alarm cut through the celebratory atmosphere like blade through silk. A serving woman burst through the main doors, her face pale with terror. "Fire!" she screamed, her voice breaking with panic. "The grain stores, they've caught fire." The initial response was swift and organized. Magnus immediately began issuing orders, directing men toward the storage buildings that held not just the Jarl's wealth, but the winter survival of everyone in Ulfheim. Eirik moved with the others, his warrior instincts taking over as the hall erupted into controlled chaos. But as they stepped outside into the cool evening air, what they saw defied explanation. The grain stores stood untouched, their thatched roofs intact under the starlight. Instead, flames roared from the eastern wing of the great hall itself, the section that housed visiting guests and stored the most precious artifacts of Magnus's lineage. "That's impossible," Leif muttered beside Eirik. "We just came from there." There were no flames, no smoke, nothing, yet the evidence blazed before them. Fire consumed the wooden structure with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural, the flames dancing in colors that shifted from orange to deep blue to silver white. The heat should have been unbearable at this distance, yet Eirik felt only a strange coolness against his skin. "The artifacts," Magnus whispered, his face crumbling as he realized what was being lost. 3 centuries of our family's history, the ceremonial weapons, the treaty scrolls. His voice broke off as a section of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks that scattered like fallen stars. That's when Eirik heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of flames and the shouts of men trying to organize a response. A voice, clear and oddly melodic, calling out words in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. The words seemed to come from within the fire itself, as if someone was trapped in the very heart of the inferno. "Did you hear that?" he asked Leif, grabbing his friend's arm. Leif looked at him with confusion. "Hear what?" "There's nothing but fire and falling timber," but Eirik heard it again, more clearly now. A young woman's voice, speaking what sounded like prayers or incantations in a tongue that made the hair on his arms stand upright. Without thinking, he stepped toward the burning building, drawn by an impulse he couldn't name or resist. "Eirik, no!" Astrid caught his sleeve, her eyes wide with fear. "The structure is collapsing. No one could survive in there." He turned to look at her, seeing his own confusion reflected in her face. "Someone is calling for help. I can hear her clearly." "Brother, there's no one in there," Leif said firmly. The guest quarters were empty tonight. Everyone is here at the feast. Yet even as his friend spoke, Eirik could hear the voice growing more urgent, the strange words taking on a rhythm that seemed to match his own heartbeat. Against every instinct for self-preservation that 4 decades of life had taught him, he pulled free from Astrid's grip and ran toward the flames. The heat hit him like a physical wall as he approached the burning structure, yet somehow he found he could push through it. The smoke should have blinded him, should have filled his lungs and dropped him choking to his knees. Yet his vision remained clear and his breathing unimpaired. He followed the voice deeper into the inferno, climbing over fallen beams that glowed like the forge fires of the gods themselves. The building groaned and shifted around him, yet his footing remained sure, as if the floor beneath his feet was being held stable by some force beyond his understanding. In the heart of the blaze, he found her. She sat in the center of what had been Magnus's most sacred chamber, the room where the Jarl kept his family's most precious heirlooms. Around her, ancient weapons and jewelry were melting into pools of metal, yet she remained untouched. Her dark hair fell in waves around a face that seemed to glow with its own inner light. And her clothes, a simple dress of undyed wool, showed no sign of burning despite being surrounded by flames hot enough to melt iron. When she looked up at him, Eirik felt the world shift beneath his feet. Her eyes held depths that spoke of ages beyond counting, of wisdom earned through suffering he couldn't imagine, and of a sadness that seemed to encompass the grief of entire peoples. Yet when she smiled, the expression transformed her face into something so beautiful it made his chest tighten with emotions he had no names for. "You came," she said, and her voice was the same one he had heard calling through the flames. "I knew you would come." Eirik dropped to one knee beside her, reaching out instinctively to pull her to safety, yet hesitating when he realized she seemed in no immediate danger from the fire that raged around them both. "Who are you?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer would change everything about the way he understood the world. "My name is Alva," she replied, accepting his outstretched hand with fingers that felt surprisingly cool despite the inferno surrounding them. "I have been waiting for you, Eirik Thorsson." The sound of his name spoken by this strange girl in this impossible situation sent chills down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "How do you know my name? How are you alive in here?" She stood with his help, moving with a grace that seemed to belong to someone far older than her apparent years. "Because this meeting was written in the runes before your grandfather's grandfather was born. Because your bloodline and mine are bound by oaths sworn when the world was younger and the gods walked more freely among mortals." As if summoned by her words, the flames around them began to shift and dance in patterns that definitely weren't natural. Eirik saw shapes in the fire, faces, figures, scenes that flickered too quickly to fully comprehend, yet left impressions burned into his memory like brands. "We need to leave," he said, practical concerns overriding the mystical strangeness of the moment. "Whatever magic protects you, this building won't hold much longer." She nodded. But as they moved toward what had been the chamber entrance, Her eyes began to glow with that same silver-white light he had seen flickering through the flames. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through his bones. "Know this, warrior of the old bloodlines," she said in words that belonged to no mortal language, yet came to his understanding as clearly as his own mother tongue. "The choosing has begun, and the ancient powers stir. What was hidden must be revealed, what was broken must be mended, and what was lost must be found." The building collapsed behind them as they emerged into the night air, sending up a pillar of sparks that painted the sky in colors that had no earthly names. Eirik carried Alva to safety, feeling the eyes of everyone in Ulfheim upon them, knowing that nothing would ever be the same. As he set her gently on her feet at a safe distance from the ruins, she looked up at him with those ancient, knowing eyes, and whispered words that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. "The last sanctuary has fallen, and our enemies know where to find us now." The questions began before dawn had fully broken over Ulfheim's smouldering ruins. Eirik sat in Magnus's private chamber, the only building that had escaped the mysterious fire completely, facing a circle of hard faces that demanded explanations he couldn't provide. The Jarl himself presided over the impromptu council, his weathered features etched with confusion and growing suspicion. "Walk me through it again," Magnus said, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of leadership. "You heard a voice that no one else could hear. You ran into flames that should have killed you instantly. And you emerged with a girl who claims to know your name, but whom none of us have ever seen before." Eirik looked around the room at faces he had known since childhood, warriors who had fought beside him, farmers who had shared their harvests in lean years, craftsmen who had forged his weapons and built his home. Now they watched him with the careful wariness usually reserved for strangers whose intentions couldn't be trusted. "That's what happened," he replied simply, knowing how impossible it sounded even as he spoke the words. "I can't explain it any more than you can." Eirik Haraldsson, Harald Bloodaxe's son and Sigrid's betrothed, leaned forward from his place at Magnus's right hand. His pale eyes held the calculating coldness that ran in his father's bloodline, like a hereditary curse. "Perhaps the explanation is simpler than we're making it. Perhaps this was no accident at all." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a damp fire. Eirik felt the temperature in the room drop as every gaze turned toward him with new speculation. In the space of a single sentence, Eirik had transformed him from hero to potential conspirator. "You're suggesting I arrange this?" Eirik's voice remained level, but his hand instinctively moved toward the pommel of his sword. "That I somehow orchestrated the destruction of my oldest friend's ancestral treasures." "I'm suggesting," Eirik replied with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes, "that the timing is remarkably convenient. Just as important alliances are being forged, just as the political landscape begins to shift toward greater stability, a mysterious fire claims the very artifacts that legitimize Magnus's ancient claims to leadership." Leif stepped forward from where he had been standing near the doorway. "Eirik Haraldsson speaks of things he doesn't understand. I've known Eirik since we were boys, learning to hold wooden swords. He would die before betraying any oath of friendship. And yet," Eirik continued, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to swaying others through carefully chosen words, "here we sit with an entire wing of this hall reduced to ash, and the only witnesses to what truly happened are a man whose loyalty to certain political arrangements might reasonably be questioned, and a mysterious girl who appeared from nowhere." Magnus raised a hand to forestall the angry responses that were building around the room. As Jarl, he had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of accusation and counter-accusation that could tear apart even the strongest communities. "Where is this girl now? If she has answers to give, let her give them." Astrid, who had been caring for Alva through the night, spoke from the doorway. "She sleeps still, Jarl Magnus. The ordeal has left her exhausted, though she shows no signs of burns or other injuries." "Convenient," Eirik murmured, loud enough to be heard by everyone present. Eirik's patience finally snapped. He stood abruptly, his considerable frame casting a shadow across the room as morning light slanted through the narrow windows. "Eirik Haraldsson, if you have accusations to make them plainly. But understand that any man who questions my honor had better be prepared to defend his words with more than clever speeches." The challenge rang through the chamber with the unmistakable finality of drawn steel. Eirik's hand moved toward his own weapon, his face flushing with the kind of anger that came from having his authority questioned in front of witnesses. The two men faced each other across the small space, and every person present understood that what happened next could determine far more than just the resolution of a personal dispute. Magnus's voice cut through the tension like an axe through timber. "There will be no bloodshed in my hall over words spoken in grief and confusion. We have all lost something precious in last night's fire: trust, certainty, the comfort of believing we understood the world around us." He stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement in a way that reminded everyone present of his advancing years. "Eirik Thorsson, you have been my friend for longer than some of these men have been alive. Your father stood beside mine in battles that decided the fate of these lands. But friendship cannot blind me to the strangeness of what occurred here." The Jarl paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood their weight. "Until we have answers that make sense of these events, I must ask that you and your household remain within my sight. Not as prisoners, but as honored guests whose safety I must guarantee while questions remain unanswered." It was masterfully done, a restriction that satisfied Eirik's demands for caution while avoiding the outright accusation that would have forced Eirik to choose between submission and open conflict. Yet the underlying message was clear. Trust, once freely given, had been suspended pending further investigation. "I understand," Eirik replied, recognizing both the wisdom and the necessity of Magnus's decision. "My family and I will accept your hospitality until these matters are resolved." Eirik looked as though he wanted to push harder, to transform this measured response into something more dramatic that would serve his father's interests. But Magnus's stern gaze reminded him that he was still a guest in another man's hall. The moment passed, tension diffusing into the kind of watchful waiting that could either lead to eventual reconciliation or gradual escalation toward inevitable confrontation. As the council disbanded, Leif moved to Eirik's side with the easy loyalty that had defined their friendship since childhood. "This won't end here," he said quietly. "Eirik sees opportunity in chaos, and his father trained him to exploit any situation that might advance their interests." Eirik nodded, already thinking through the implications of what had just occurred. "Magnus is in an impossible position. If he defends me too strongly, he risks appearing weak to Harald's faction. If he doesn't, he loses the support of families like ours, who've stood with him for generations. What about the girl? What about Alva?" That was the question that gnawed at Eirik's thoughts, like a splinter that couldn't be extracted. Everything rational told him to distance himself from the mysterious young woman whose appearance had coincided so perfectly with disaster. Yet something deeper than reason insisted that abandoning her would be the greatest mistake of his life. "I need to speak with her," he said finally. "Whatever she is, whatever she knows about what happened, she's the only one who might have answers." They made their way through the settlement toward the small house where Astrid had taken Alva for the night. The morning air still carried the acrid smell of burned wood and melted metal, and everywhere they looked, people were going about their daily tasks with the kind of forced normalcy that follows unexpected tragedy. Children who had been laughing and playing just yesterday now stayed close to their parents. Men who had been planning seasonal hunts and winter preparations now spoke in low voices about protective watches and hidden weapons. The sense of security that had sheltered Ulfheim for generations had been shattered as thoroughly as if enemy raiders had appeared on the horizon. As they approached the house, Eirik wondered if his strange dreams were connected to the previous night's events. The visions of fire and calling voices now seemed less like imagination and more like warnings he had failed to interpret. Whatever answers Alva might provide, Eirik understood his life had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The certainties that had guided 4 decades had burned away, leaving him to navigate toward unknown destinations. Alva was awake when they arrived, sitting beside the small window that overlooked the settlement's main thoroughfare. She had exchanged her mysterious fireproof dress for one of Astrid's simpler garments, yet somehow the change in clothing only emphasized rather than diminished her otherworldly presence. In daylight, her features carried an ageless quality that made it impossible to determine whether she was 16 or 60. "Eirik," she said without turning from the window, as if she had sensed his approach long before his footsteps reached the door. "You're troubled by questions that have no easy answers." Astrid looked up from where she had been preparing a simple meal of bread and honey. "She's been like this since she woke, speaking of things before they happen, knowing things she shouldn't know." Her voice carried a mixture of fascination and unease that Eirik understood completely. He settled into the chair across from Alva, studying her face for any sign of deception or madness. Instead, he found only a profound sadness that seemed to encompass griefs far older than her apparent years could account for. "Tell me who you are," he said simply. "Not riddles, not prophecies, just truth." She smiled, and for a moment her face transformed into something that might have belonged to any young woman in any village throughout the northern lands. Truth is rarely simple, especially when it involves bloodlines that stretch back to the time when gods and mortals shared the same fires. Leif shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. "She speaks like the old seers, the ones who used to wander between settlements before the new religion started driving them away." "Because that's what I am," Alva replied, finally turning from the window to face them directly. "Or what I was raised to be, before circumstances forced me into hiding among ordinary folk." The words hung in the small room like incense from an unfamiliar temple. Eirik felt something deep in his chest respond to her admission, a recognition that bypassed rational thought and touched something more fundamental. "Seers haven't walked these lands openly for more than a generation," Astrid said carefully. "The Christian priests drove them out, claimed their practices were devil's work." "Not drove out," Alva corrected gently. "Driven underground, hidden, protected, by families who remembered the old ways and understood that some knowledge shouldn't be lost just because new beliefs demand it." She stood and moved to the center of the room, her movements carrying a ritual quality that made the simple space feel suddenly sacred. "My mother was the last of the Volr spirits who could walk freely in the world of men. My father was mortal, a warrior whose bloodline stretched back to the first settlements in these lands." Eirik's breath caught as understanding began to dawn. The Volr spirits, they were said to be the bridge between the world of gods and the world of men. Were, are, will be. Alva's eyes began to glow with that strange inner light he had seen in the fire. Time moves differently for those who carry divine blood, even diluted as mine has become through generations of mortal mixing. She reached into the small bag that contained her only possessions, items that had somehow survived. The fire that should have consumed everything in the guest chambers. From it, she withdrew a pendant unlike anything Eirik had ever seen. The artifact was clearly ancient, worked from silver that had been shaped by techniques lost to current craftsmen. Its surface bore runes that seemed to shift and dance when viewed directly, never quite settling into patterns that mortal eyes could fully comprehend. At its center sat a stone that captured light and transformed it into colors that had no names in any earthly language. "The cider stone," she said, holding it out for them to see but not touch. "One of 7 that were created when the gods first walked among mortals. Each stone chooses its keeper, and through that keeper, the ancient powers can still work in a world that increasingly rejects their existence." Leif stepped back involuntarily as the pendant began to pulse with gentle radiance. "That's why the fire couldn't harm you. The stone protected you. The stone and something else." Alva's gaze fixed on Eirik with an intensity that made him feel as though she was seeing through his skin to something deeper. "Your bloodline, Eirik Thorsson, carries echoes of the First Covenant, the oath sworn between gods and certain mortal families when the boundaries between worlds were first established. The implications struck him like a physical blow. "You're saying my ancestors were bound to serve the old gods?" "Not serve, partner, protect." When the divine powers chose to step back from direct involvement in mortal affairs, they left guardians behind, families whose bloodlines carried just enough divine essence to serve as bridges when the need arose. Astrid moved closer to her husband, her hand finding his arm with the automatic gesture of someone seeking comfort in familiar contact. "But that would mean that Eirik's rescue of me wasn't coincidence," Alva finished. "It was recognition. His blood called to mine across the flames, because that's what it was designed to do centuries before either of us was born." The small room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Outside, they could hear the normal sounds of settlement life. Children calling to each other, animals being led to pasture, the rhythmic hammering of metal being shaped in the smithy. Yet inside this space, reality had shifted to accommodate truths that belonged to a much older and stranger world. "If this is true," Eirik said slowly, "then what happened last night was just the beginning." Alva nodded gravely. "The balance has been disturbed. Powers that have slept for generations are stirring, and not all of them wish well for the world of mortals. The destruction of my hiding place was deliberate, a message that the old protections are failing and new alliances must be forged." She moved to the window again, her gaze turning northward toward the mountains that formed the backbone of the known world. "There are others like me, scattered and hidden, each carrying pieces of the old knowledge. But we're being hunted by forces that see our existence as a threat to their vision of what the world should become." "What kind of forces?" Leif asked, though his tone suggested he already feared the answer. "Some wear the robes of the new religion and speak of purifying the land of heathen influences. Others wear the faces of ambitious men who seek power without understanding the consequences of destroying the ancient. Balances that keep certain evils contained." Eirik felt pieces of a vast puzzle beginning to align in his mind. Harald Bloodaxe. His expansion, his political maneuvering, it's not just about earthly power. A man like Harald draws the attention of powers that feed on chaos and conflict, Alva confirmed. Whether he knows it or not, his actions serve purposes larger and darker than mere human ambition. The conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the door. Astrid opened it to reveal one of Magnus's household guards, his face flushed with the exertion of running. "Eirik Thorsson," the man said, breathing heavily. "The Jarl requests your immediate presence. Ships have been sighted on the horizon. Harald Bloodaxe's fleet approaches under battle. Standards!" The war horns of Ulfheim echoed across the fjord like the voices of ancient giants calling their kin to battle. From the high watchtower that overlooked the harbour, Eirik could see Harald Bloodaxe's fleet spreading across the water like a dark stain. 12 longships bearing the crimson and black, banners that had become synonymous with conquest. Throughout the northern territories, Magnus stood beside him on the wooden platform, his weathered hands gripping the rail with enough force to leave permanent impressions in the oak. The Jarl's face bore the grim expression of a man who understood that everything he had spent a lifetime building was about to be tested by forces beyond his control. 60 men per ship, at minimum, Magnus calculated aloud, his voice carrying the steady tone he had learned to maintain during crisis. Perhaps more if Harald is bringing his elite household guards. We have maybe 200 able-bodied fighters in the settlement, counting boys barely old enough to lift a sword. Leif lowered the brass spyglass he had been using to study the approaching vessels. The lead ship flies Harald's personal standard. He's come himself, which means this isn't just a show of force. He intends to resolve something here today. Eirik Haraldsson had joined them on the platform, ostensibly to offer his expertise regarding his father's tactical preferences. But his presence felt more like that of a spy, ensuring the proper outcome of negotiations. His pale eyes moved constantly between the approaching fleet and the faces of Ulfheim's defenders. calculating odds and opportunities with the cold precision that ran in his bloodline. "My father is a reasonable man," Eirik said, though his tone suggested he was reciting words rather than expressing conviction. "If the terms of our alliance are honored, if the questions surrounding last night's incident are resolved satisfactorily, there need be no bloodshed." Magnus turned to face him directly. "And what would constitute satisfactory resolution, in your father's view?" "Assurance that certain disruptive influences are removed from positions where they might threaten the stability we're all working to achieve." Eirik's gaze shifted meaningfully toward Eirik. "My father believes in eliminating problems before they can grow into larger difficulties." The implication hung in the air like smoke from green wood. Eirik felt the familiar weight of his hand on his sword hilt, the automatic response of a warrior who had learned to recognize the moment when diplomacy transforms into something more direct. Yet he forced himself to remain still, understanding that any aggressive move on his part would only serve Eirik's purposes. "Your father assumes much about events he didn't witness," Eirik replied carefully. "Perhaps he should hear the full account before deciding what constitutes a problem." Below them, the settlement bustled with the controlled urgency of people preparing for potential siege. Weapons that had been stored away after the last conflict were being retrieved from hidden places. Women gathered children into the strongest buildings, while men took positions along the crude fortifications that ringed Ulfheim's most vital structures. Astrid appeared at the base of the watchtower, her face upturned toward the platform where the men conducted their grim calculations. "The girl," she called up to Eirik. "Alva says she needs to speak with you before Harald's ships reach the harbor." Magnus frowned. "Whatever she has to say can wait until we've dealt with the immediate threat. With respect." "Jarl," Astrid replied, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of managing crises. "She claims her words might prevent bloodshed altogether." Eirik's expression sharpened with sudden interest. "Perhaps the mysterious maiden has remembered something useful about her origins, something that might clarify the circumstances of her appearance." Eirik recognized the trap being set. If Alva revealed her true nature publicly, Eirik would use her supernatural abilities as evidence of dark sorcery that justified Harald's intervention. If she remained silent, her continued presence would be seen as proof of Eirik's guilt by association. "I'll speak with her," Eirik decided, "but privately, away from ears that might misinterpret words spoken in desperation." As he climbed down from the watchtower, leaving Magnus and the others to continue their military preparations, Eirik felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders like winter snow. Every path forward seemed to lead toward conflict, either the immediate violence of Harald's fleet or the slower but equally destructive erosion of trust that would follow any revelation of Alva's true nature. He found her waiting in the small shrine that sat at the heart of Ulfheim's oldest quarter. The building predated the settlement itself, a remnant from the time when this stretch of coast had been sacred to gods whose names were now spoken only in whispers. Ancient stones formed its foundation, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and flow when viewed from the corner of one's eye. Alva knelt before the altar where Magnus's ancestors had once made offerings to powers that controlled wind and wave. In her hand she held the cider stone, its surface pulsing with gentle light that cast strange shadows on the shrine's weathered walls. "You've seen what approaches," she said, without turning to acknowledge his presence. "Harald brings more than warriors. There are others aboard those ships, men who serve masters that mortal eyes cannot perceive." Eirik felt ice form in his veins despite the warmth of the afternoon. "What kind of masters?" "The kind that feast on fear and grow stronger with each life claimed in meaningless conflict." She stood and turned to face him, her eyes reflecting depths that seemed to encompass the grief of entire civilizations. "Harald thinks he serves his own ambition, but he has become a tool of forces that see mortal rulers as useful puppets in games played across centuries." The implications struck him like physical blows. "Then this isn't about political alliances or territorial expansion. Those things matter to Harald, but to his hidden masters. This settlement represents something much more significant. She gestured toward the ancient stones that formed the shrine's foundation. Ulfheim sits upon one of the old crossing places, locations where the barriers between worlds grow thin during certain seasons. And if Magnus falls, if the bloodlines that have protected this place for generations are eliminated, then something that has been safely contained for centuries will be free to walk in the world of mortals once again. Outside, the war horn sounded again, closer now as Harald's fleet approached the harbor. Time was running out for decisions that might prevent not just immediate bloodshed, but consequences that could echo through generations yet unborn. "What would you have me do?" Eirik asked. Though he suspected the answer would require sacrifices he wasn't certain he was prepared to make. Alva's expression softened, and for a moment she looked like nothing more than a frightened young woman facing circumstances beyond her ability to control. "Help me reach the Moonwell before Harald's forces can secure the settlement. If we can activate the old protections, we might be able to contain what's coming long enough to find a more permanent solution. The Moonwell is 3 days' ride north, through territory that will soon be crawling with Harald's scouts, I know. But it's our only hope of preventing a darkness that would make Harald's conquest seem like a blessing by comparison." The shrine's ancient stones began to resonate with a low harmonic that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself, as if the very bones of the world were responding to the approaching threat with warnings that only those with the proper bloodlines could hear. The first of Harald's longships ground against the harbor, stones just as the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows that seemed to move independently of the clouds passing overhead. Eirik watched from the shrine's doorway as armed men poured from the vessels like ants from a disturbed hill, their movements coordinated with the precision that spoke of extensive training and absolute discipline. At their head strode Harald Bloodaxe himself, a man whose reputation had grown so large over the years that seeing him in person was almost anticlimactic. He stood no taller than average height, bore no visible scars from legendary battles, and moved with the calculated ease of someone who had learned that true power lay not in personal prowess, but in the ability to command others. Yet something about his presence made the very air seem heavier, as if reality bent slightly around him to accommodate a will that refused to recognize normal limitations. "He's changed," Alva whispered from behind Eirik, her voice carrying a note of recognition that sent chills down his spine. "When last I saw him, he was merely ambitious. Now something else looks through his eyes." Eirik turned to stare at her. "You've met Harald before?" "Years ago, when I was still learning to control my gifts and traveled openly as my mother's apprentice. He sought the services of a seer to guide his campaigns, but my mother refused him. She said his future paths led only to darkness, and that helping him would do more than just his enemies." Through the shrine's narrow window, they watched Harald's forces spread through Ulfheim streets with the methodical efficiency of an occupying army. Magnus had positioned his own warriors at key defensive points, but the disparity in numbers was obvious to anyone with military experience. This would not be a battle, but a negotiation conducted under the implicit threat of massacre. There, the tall man in the black robes who stays close to Harald's right shoulder, Alva pointed toward a figure who seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "He wasn't with Harald during our previous encounter. That one serves powers that predate human civilization." The robed figure moved with a gliding motion that suggested feet that never quite touched the ground. His face remained hidden within the depths of his hood, yet Eirik felt the weight of unseen eyes scanning the settlement as if searching for something specific. "He's looking for me," Alva said with certainty that came from experience rather than speculation. The cider stone carries a resonance that those trained in the dark arts can detect across great distances. "My presence here has been sensed." Magnus appeared in the settlement's central square, flanked by his most trusted advisors and warriors. His bearing remained proud despite the circumstances. and his voice carried clearly across the distance as he called out the traditional greeting offered to visitors who came bearing arms. "Harald Bloodaxe, you are welcome in Ulfheim, as befits your reputation and the bonds of friendship that have long existed between our peoples. Yet you come with many ships and many warriors to a celebration feast. What brings such force to our humble shores?" Harald's response carried the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance rather than negotiation. "Magnus the Greybeard, I come to discuss matters that affect the security and prosperity of all northern settlements. Certain recent events have raised questions that require clear answers. The ritual dance of formal diplomacy began, each leader speaking words that carried multiple meanings, while their respective forces positioned themselves for whatever outcome the negotiations might produce. Yet Eirik noticed that the robed figure paid no attention to the political maneuvering. Instead, he continued his systematic examination of the settlement, his hidden gaze probing each building and shadow, as if he could see through stone and timber to whatever lay within. "We need to leave now," Alva said urgently. Before he completes his search and pinpoints our exact location, Eirik considered their options with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent decades evaluating tactical situations. The settlement's northern gate remained unguarded, Harald's forces having concentrated on controlling the harbour and main thoroughfares. Yet reaching it would require crossing open ground that would expose them to observation by anyone watching from elevated positions. "My horse is stabled near the northern wall," he said. "If we can reach it without being seen, we might be able to slip away while Harald's attention remains focused on Magnus." They moved carefully through Ulfheim's back streets, staying in shadows and taking advantage of the confusion created by Harald's arrival. Everywhere they looked, normal life had been suspended in favor of the tense watchfulness that accompanied potential violence. Children had disappeared from the streets, shutters had been closed and barred, and the few people they encountered moved with the furtive haste of those trying to avoid notice. As they approached the stable where Eirik kept his horse, Astrid emerged from a side alley with Leif close behind her. Both carried traveling packs and wore the grim expressions of people who had made difficult decisions under pressure. "We're coming with you," Astrid announced in a tone that brooked no argument. "Whatever this journey involves, you'll need allies you can trust completely." Leif nodded his agreement. "Besides, staying here serves no purpose if Harald intends to use force, regardless of what Magnus offers. Better to preserve something that might eventually return, to reclaim what was lost." Eirik felt torn between gratitude for their loyalty and concern for their safety. "This isn't a normal flight from political enemies. Where we're going, what we're facing, it involves powers that don't distinguish between warriors and civilians. Then, it's even more important that you don't face them alone," Astrid replied firmly. Before Eirik could respond, the sound of running footsteps echoed from the direction of the settlement's center. A young boy, one of Magnus's pages, rounded the corner at full sprint, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "The Jarl sends word," he gasped. "Harald demands the immediate surrender of the foreign woman who appeared during last night's fire. He claims she carries plague spirits that threaten all righteous folk." Alva's expression hardened with understanding. "The dark sorcerer has identified my presence and provided Harald with justification for whatever he was already planning to do." The boy continued his urgent message. "Magnus buys what time he can through negotiation, but Harald grows impatient. He speaks of cleansing fire and the need to purify the land of unnatural influences." Through the stable's open doorway, they could see smoke beginning to rise from various points throughout the settlement. Not the chaotic smoke of accidental fire, but the controlled flames of systematic burning, buildings being put to the torch in a deliberate pattern that spoke of military precision rather than random destruction. "They're not just searching for me," Alva realized with growing horror. "They're destroying anything that might harbor traces of the old powers. Books, artifacts, even stones that bear ancient carvings." The implications struck Eirik like a physical blow. If Harold's forces were systematically eliminating all connections to the pre-Christian past, then this wasn't simply about political control or personal ambition. Someone had convinced Harold that the old ways represented an existential threat that could only be addressed through complete eradication. "The crossing place," Alva whispered, her face pale with understanding. "They're not just trying to capture me. They're preparing to break the barriers that keep certain entities confined to their own realm. The fires, the destruction of sacred objects, it's all part of a ritual designed to weaken the ancient protections." Time had run out for careful planning or gradual escape. Whatever forces moved behind Harold's invasion had accelerated their timeline, forcing choices that would have consequences stretching far beyond the fate of a single settlement. The escape from Ulfheim proved easier than expected, though not for reasons that brought comfort. Harold's forces had concentrated on controlling the settlement's center and harbor, leaving the northern approaches lightly guarded in what appeared to be tactical oversight. Only as their small party reached the tree, line above the fjord, did Eirik realize the terrible truth. They had been allowed to flee. "We're being herded," he told the others as they paused to rest their horses in a grove of ancient pines. "Harold could have sealed every escape route if he'd wanted to prevent our departure." Leaf wiped sweat from his forehead, despite the cool mountain air. "Perhaps he simply underestimated our resolve to flee rather than negotiate." Alva shook her head, her face grave with understanding that came from sources deeper than tactical analysis. "He wants us to reach the Moonwell. Whatever ritual his dark advisor is conducting, our arrival at that place serves their purposes rather than opposing them." The implications settled over the group like fog rolling in from the sea. Everything they had assumed about their mission, every hope they had harbored about preventing disaster, had been built upon foundations that were crumbling beneath their feet. Astrid voiced what they were all thinking. "Then we're walking into a trap." "Worse than a trap," Alva replied, pulling the cedar stone from her traveling pouch. The ancient artifact pulsed with agitated light, its normally steady glow fluctuating in patterns that spoke of disturbance in the fundamental forces it was designed to monitor. "We're about to become unwilling participants in a ceremony that will reshape the boundaries between worlds." Eirik studied the stone's erratic pulsing, remembering childhood stories his grandmother had told about the old times, when such artifacts had been common enough that even ordinary families might own lesser examples. "Can you tell what kind of ceremony? What they hope to accomplish?" Before Alva could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the forest. The party tensed, hands moving instinctively to weapons, but the rider who emerged from the trees bore no resemblance to Harold's warriors. Instead, an elderly woman approached on a horse, whose coat seemed to shift between black and grey with each step. She dismounted with the fluid grace of someone far younger than her weathered features suggested, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the very trees seem to lean closer to listen. "Daughter of the Volr," she addressed Alva directly, using words in the old tongue that predated the arrival of the northern peoples in these lands. "Your mother sends greeting across the gulf that separates the living from those who have passed beyond mortal concerns." Alva's face transformed with recognition, and something that might have been relief. "Ragnhild the Farseer, I thought you had departed for the western shores years ago." "I had. But dreams called me back, visions of endings that might become beginnings if the proper choices are made in the hours to come." The old woman's gaze shifted to Eirik, studying him with eyes that seemed to catalogue not just his physical presence, but something deeper. "And you must be the Guardian-born, the one whose bloodline carries echoes of the first compact." Eirik felt uncomfortable under her scrutiny, as if she was reading truths about him that he himself didn't yet understand. "I'm nobody special. Just a warrior caught up in events beyond his comprehension." Ragnhild's laugh carried the sound of wind through mountain peaks. "Modesty becomes you, but accuracy serves better in times like these." Your ancestors were among the first to swear binding oaths to the powers that shaped this realm. That oath passes through bloodlines, whether the descendants understand their inheritance or not. She moved closer, reaching out to touch the pommel of his sword with fingers that trembled slightly with age. The moment her skin made contact with the ancient steel, both the weapon and the cider stone began to resonate with the same harmonic frequency, creating a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. "The weapon remembers," she said with satisfaction. "Good. We will need all the old bindings to remain strong for what comes next." Leif stepped forward, his practical nature asserting itself despite the mystical strangeness of the encounter. "Old woman, speak plainly. We know something terrible approaches, but riddles and prophecies help no one plan for actual dangers." Ragnhild's expression grew somber as she addressed the entire group. "Very well. Plain speaking for a plain crisis. The entity that whispers in Harald's ear has spent decades engineering this moment. Every political alliance Harald has forged, every territorial expansion he has pursued, every enemy he has made, all of it has been guided toward this single purpose." She gestured toward the north, where the moonwell lay hidden among peaks that few mortals had ever climbed. That place was sealed long ago to contain something that the ancient powers deemed too dangerous to exist freely in the world. But seals can be broken if the proper conditions are created. "What conditions?" Astrid asked, though her tone suggested she already feared the answer. "Blood sacrifice from specific bloodlines, willing or unwilling, performed at the moment when the barriers between worlds grow thinnest. The autumn equinox approaches. In 3 days, the veil between realms will be at its weakest point in decades." Alva's face had grown pale as understanding dawned. "They need both of us. My blood carries the power to open gateways, while Eirik's can bind entities to this realm permanently." "Precisely," Ragnhild confirmed. "Together, you represent the keys to a lock that has protected this world for centuries. Apart, you are merely individuals with interesting ancestry. But if your blood mingles on the altar stones while the proper rituals are performed," she didn't need to finish. The image formed clearly in everyone's mind. Something ancient and malevolent, freed from supernatural imprisonment, bound permanently to the physical world, and owing its liberation to the dark powers that had engineered its release. "So we don't go to the Moonwell," Eirik said with the practical decisiveness that had served him well in countless military situations. "We break the pattern, refuse to play the role assigned to us." Ragnhild shook her head sadly. "If only it were that simple. The ritual has multiple paths to completion. If you flee, they will simply hunt down other bearers of the necessary bloodlines. Your cousin's children carry the same inherited power as do the descendants of 3 other guardian families." The trap's true scope became clear. They weren't just being herded toward a single confrontation. They were being forced to choose between accepting their role in a cosmic disaster or watching innocents suffer the consequences of their refusal. "However," the old seer continued, her voice taking on a note of carefully controlled hope, "there is another possibility. If the ritual can be interrupted at precisely the right moment, if the gathered power can be redirected rather than simply released, then what was meant to serve darkness might instead strengthen the barriers that protect this realm." She reached into her traveling pack and withdrew an object that made the air around it shimmer with barely contained energy. It appeared to be a simple silver knife, but its blade caught light in ways that defied natural law, and runes along its handle seemed to write themselves in languages that predated human speech. "The Sundering Blade," she announced, "forged in the first days when gods walked openly among mortals, designed specifically to cut through the bonds that tie entities to realms where they don't belong." Eirik stared at the weapon, understanding instinctively that accepting it would transform him from reluctant participant into active agent in events that would determine the fate of the world he knew. "What would we have to do?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer would. "Require sacrifices that would change everything about the life he had spent 4 decades Building, the journey to the Moonwell took 2 days, through terrain that seemed designed to test both physical endurance and mental resolve. Ancient paths wound between peaks that pierced the sky like the spears of buried giants, while mist-shrouded valleys echoed with sounds that belonged to no earthly creatures. With each mile northward, the boundary between the natural and supernatural grew thinner, until even practical life began to glance nervously at shadows that moved independently of their sources. Ragnhild led them along routes that appeared on no mortal maps, following markers that consisted of standing stones so weathered by time that their original carvings had become suggestions rather than clear symbols. She moved with the confidence of someone who had walked these paths before, yet her increasingly frequent pauses to consult the position of stars suggested that the landscape itself was shifting in response to the approaching ritual. The closer we come to the equinox, the more unstable the boundaries become, she explained during one such pause. What you see around you now may not be there when we return, if we return. Eirik had been carrying the sundering blade since their departure from the forest camp, and with each hour, the weapon's influence on him grew more pronounced. The silver knife seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, and occasionally he caught glimpses of images in its polished surface, scenes of battles fought in ages when mortals and immortals shared the same battlefields. Alva rode beside him, the cider stone now glowing so brightly that she had to keep it covered to avoid attracting unwanted attention from whatever entities might be watching their progress. The artifact's increasing radiance suggested they were approaching something that resonated with its power, but whether that something was friend or enemy remained unclear. "Tell me about this creature we're trying to prevent from escaping," Eirik asked as they navigated a particularly treacherous mountain pass. "If I'm going to risk everything to keep it contained, I should understand what kind of threat it represents." Ragnhild's expression grew distant, as if she was seeing across vast spans of time to events that predated written history. "It has many names in many languages, but the essence remains constant, a force of pure entropy that feeds on the dissolution of order. In the early days, when the barriers between worlds were more fluid, it wandered freely through realms, consuming entire civilizations and leaving only chaos in its wake. What stopped it before?" Astrid asked, her practical mind focused on actionable information, a coalition of powers that put aside their own conflicts to address a threat that endangered all existence. "God's spirits and the most powerful mortal sorcerers worked together to create a prison that would hold until the cosmic forces aligned." Differently, Leif guided his horse around a boulder that seemed to shift position when viewed directly. "And those forces are aligning differently now?" "Not naturally," Alva interjected. "The alignment is being forced through ritual manipulation. Harald's advisor has spent decades creating the precise conditions needed to weaken the prison enough that a focused ceremony could shatter it completely." As they reached the highest point of the pass, the Moonwell finally came into view in the valley below. The sight took Eirik's breath away and filled him with dread in equal measure. The ancient structure rose from the valley floor like a crown of silver and obsidian, its impossibly tall spires twisted into configurations that hurt to look at directly. Around its base, a lake of water so dark it seemed to absorb light reflected stars that weren't visible in the actual sky above. "By all the gods," Leif whispered, making protective signs that his grandmother had taught him in childhood. "What manner of place is this?" "A wound in reality," Ragnhild answered soberly, "created when the entity was first imprisoned. The structure you see exists simultaneously in this world and the realm where the creature is contained. During the equinox, when the barriers weaken, those two existences will overlap enough to allow passage between them. Harald's forces had arrived ahead of them. Even at this distance, they could see the methodical construction of ritual circles around the well's perimeter, using materials that gleamed with unnatural luminescence. Figures in black robes moved among the workers, directing the placement of artifacts that seemed to bend space around themselves. How many? Eirik asked, though he was already counting the campfires that dotted the valley floor like fallen stars. More than we can fight directly, Alva replied. But direct confrontation isn't the goal. We need to reach the center chamber during the moment when the ritual reaches its peak, when all the accumulated power is focused on breaking the prison bonds. Ragnhild pulled a leather-wrapped bundle from her pack, revealing instruments that belonged to no earthly craft. Star charts marked with symbols that seemed to move across their surfaces. Crystals that sang in harmonies too complex for human ears to fully process. And vials containing liquids that gave off their own light. The ceremony will begin at sunset tomorrow, she announced after consulting her mystical tools. The actual moment of maximum vulnerability will occur exactly at midnight, when the equinox reaches its precise center point. We have perhaps 20 hours to prepare. Astrid studied the enemy encampment with the tactical eye she had developed during years of defending her own household. What's our approach? The direct path down the mountainside is completely exposed. There are older ways. Ragnhild indicated a series of barely visible markings on the valley's eastern wall. Passages carved by those who built the original prison. They lead directly to the Wells Foundation, but using them will trigger protective wards that were set in place to prevent unauthorized access. What kind of protective wards? Leif asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be encouraging. The kind designed to distinguish between those who come to strengthen the prison and those who come to break it. If our intentions are pure and our commitment absolute, the passages should allow us to pass. If there's any doubt, any hidden motivation that serves the enemy's purposes, she didn't need to finish. The implication was clear. The ancient defenses would eliminate anyone whose presence might compromise the prison's integrity, regardless of their conscious intentions. As night fell around their hidden camp, Eirik found himself staring at the sundering blade, trying to understand the weight of responsibility that had fallen to him. Tomorrow's choices would determine not just his own fate, but the future of a world that had no idea how close it stood to unimaginable catastrophe. Alva approached him as the others settled into uneasy sleep. "You're afraid," she observed, not as accusation but as simple statement of fact. "Terrified," he admitted. "I'm a simple warrior who's found himself holding the key to cosmic forces I don't understand. Everything about this situation is beyond my experience." She settled beside him, her presence bringing unexpected comfort despite the strangeness of their circumstances. "My mother once told me that the greatest acts of courage come not from those who feel no fear, but from those who act rightly despite being afraid. The old powers chose your bloodline for protection, precisely because your people never sought dominion over forces beyond their understanding. What if I make the wrong choice? What if my hesitation costs us the moment when action might have made a difference? Then we'll face the consequences together," she replied simply. "But I've seen enough of your character to trust that when the moment comes, you'll know what needs to be done." Above them, the aurora began to dance across the northern sky in patterns that followed no natural law, as if the approaching equinox was causing reality itself to become unstable. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or catastrophe, and the difference would be measured in seconds of perfect timing, and the courage to act when hesitation meant the end of everything they had ever known. Eirik closed his eyes and tried to find the center of calm that had served him through 4 decades of conflict, knowing that tomorrow's battle would be unlike any he had ever faced, fought with weapons that could reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. The ancient passage opened before them, like the throat of some primordial beast, its walls carved from stone that predated human civilization. Phosphorescent markings provided just enough light to navigate by, yet the symbols seemed to shift and writhe whenever glimpsed from the corner of one's eye. Eirik led the way, the sundering blade humming with anticipation in his grip, while behind him, Alva's cider stone cast dancing shadows that made the narrow tunnel feel even more claustrophobic. They had entered the passage system just as the sun touched the western peaks, timing their descent to coincide with the beginning of Harold's ritual above. Through cracks in the ancient stonework, they could hear the rhythmic chanting that marked the ceremony's opening. Phases, voices raised in languages that human throats were never meant to pronounce. "The wards are testing us," Ragnhild whispered from behind them. Her voice carried strain that spoke of magical energies probing at the boundaries of their minds, searching for hidden motivations or secret doubts that might compromise their mission. "Stay focused on your purpose. Think only of protection, of preservation, of duty to those who cannot defend themselves." Leif stumbled as the tunnel floor shifted beneath his feet, ancient mechanisms responding to their presence with grinding sounds that echoed through the stone like the bones of sleeping giants. "How much farther?" "We're directly beneath the well's outer ring now," Alva replied, consulting the cedar stone's increasingly erratic pulsing. "The main chamber lies just ahead, but the final approach will be the most heavily warded." As if summoned by her words, the passage ahead began to glow with cold fire that outlined doorways carved in architectural styles that belonged to no earthly culture. Each opening led to chambers that defied spatial logic, rooms that seemed larger inside than outside, corridors that curved back upon themselves, stairways that ascended and descended simultaneously. "A maze," Astrid observed, her practical mind struggling to process geometry that violated natural law. "But which path leads to our destination?" Eirik closed his eyes and let the sundering blade guide him, feeling the weapon's ancient intelligence respond to the proximity of its intended target. The silver knife grew warm in his hand, its blade pointing steadily toward the leftmost passage, despite the visual evidence suggesting that path led deeper into the mountain rather than toward the well. "This way," he said, following the blade's guidance into a tunnel that seemed to stretch impossibly far into darkness. Behind them, the other passages began to seal themselves with the slow finality of stone, growing like living tissue. The final stretch of their underground journey took them through chambers that told the story of the entity's original imprisonment. Carved reliefs covered every surface, depicting scenes of cosmic battle that dwarfed mortal conflicts. Gods and spirits locked in combat with something that appeared as shifting darkness given form, while mortal heroes wielded weapons that blazed with divine fire. "My ancestors," Eirik realized as he recognized faces carved in the stone that bore unmistakable resemblance to his own features. They were actually there, at the original binding. "More than present," Ragnhild confirmed. "They were instrumental. The entity could not be destroyed. Forces of pure entropy cannot be unmade without unmaking existence itself. But it could be contained if the proper bloodlines willingly bound themselves to maintain the prison across generations." The implications struck him like a physical blow. "Then all of this, my family's prosperity, our position in the community, even my marriage to Astrid, was guided by powers beyond mortal comprehension to ensure that when this moment arrived, the guardian bloodline would be ready," Alva finished gently. "Your life has never been entirely your own, Eirik Thorsson. You were born to stand in this place at this time, holding that blade." They emerged from the passage system into a chamber that defied description. The space existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, its walls stretching away into distances that couldn't be measured by ordinary means. At its center stood the Moonwell, itself a structure of crystalline beauty that held within its depth something so terrible that looking directly at it caused physical pain. The entity moved within its prison like oil, given malevolent intelligence, occasionally pressing against the crystalline walls with force that made reality ripple like water disturbed by thrown stones. Each impact sent shockwaves through the chamber that registered not just as sound and vibration, but as fundamental wrongness that made every instinct scream in terror. Above them, visible through a gap in the chamber's ceiling that revealed the night sky, Harold's ritual had reached its crescendo. Robot figures stood at precise points around the well's perimeter, their voices raised in harmonies that seemed to weaken the prison's walls with each passing moment. Energy crackled between their outstretched hands, weaving patterns of force that struck the crystalline structure like hammers against glass. "Now," Ragnhild commanded, producing a collection of items that blazed with their own inner light. While their attention is focused on breaking the prison, we must reach the control matrix and redirect their gathered power. The control matrix materialized as they approached, a complex arrangement of crystals, metals, and substances that belonged to no earthly realm. It pulsed in rhythm with the entity's movements, each pulse weakening as the ritual above continued its work of dissolution. Eirik must use the sundering blade to cut the connection between the prison and the power source they're corrupting. Alva explained rapidly as cracks began to appear in the crystalline walls. "I'll use the cider stone to redirect that energy into strengthening the containment rather than breaking it. But the timing must be perfect. If either of us acts too early or too late, the feedback will destroy us all." The entity seemed to sense their presence and purpose. Its movements within the prison became more violent, causing the chamber to shake with increasing intensity. Where its essence touched the crystalline walls, the transparent material began to cloud and crack, releasing wisps of darkness that moved with predatory intelligence. "It's trying to break free before we can complete the counter-ritual," Ragnhild realized with growing alarm. The prison won't hold much longer under this assault. Through the opening above, they could see Harald himself now standing at the ritual's center, his arms raised toward the star-filled sky as power coursed through him from his dark advisor. The man who had once been merely ambitious had become a conduit for forces that cared nothing for his personal goals, using him as a focus for energies that would remake the world according to alien desires. "Do it now," Alva shouted as the prison's walls began to fail catastrophically. Eirik raised the sundering blade as the crystalline prison shattered into fragments of light that cut through the air like falling stars. The moment the weapon touched the control matrix, reality exploded into chaos. Energy that had been carefully contained for centuries erupted outward in waves that made the chamber's impossible dimensions collapse and reform with each pulse. The entity burst from its failing prison with the fury of entropy-given form, its darkness spreading across the chamber like spilled ink. Where it touched stone, the ancient walls began to crumble. Where it encountered the phosphorescent markings that had provided their light, those symbols guttered and died, leaving only spreading patches of absolute void. "Hold the connection," Alva screamed over the roar of unleashed cosmic forces, the cedar stone blazing in her hands as she fought to redirect the ritual's power. Blood ran from her nose and ears as energies beyond mortal comprehension coursed through her body. Yet she maintained her grip on the ancient artifact with determination born of desperation. Above them, Harald's voice rose in triumph, believing his ritual had achieved its purpose. The dark advisor stood beside him, arms raised toward the midnight sky, drawing down power from alignments of stars that existed in dimensions mortal eyes couldn't perceive. Neither man realized that their moment of apparent victory was actually the beginning of their undoing. The sundering blade cut through metaphysical bonds that had held for millennia. But instead of severing the entity's connection to this realm, Eirik used the weapon to redirect those connections toward the strengthened prison matrix that Alva was weaving from the corrupted ritual energy. It was like trying to forge chains from liquid fire while standing in the heart of a volcano. The entity, suddenly aware that its freedom was being transformed into deeper bondage, turned its attention toward the small group of mortals who dared oppose it. Tentacles of pure darkness lashed out toward them, each contact threatening to drain not just life, but the very concept of existence from whatever it touched. Leif threw himself between the entity and Astrid, his sword blazing with borrowed light from the cedar stone as he carved through shadows that tried to drag him into nothingness. "Whatever you're doing, do it faster!" Ragnhild began chanting in the oldest tongue she knew, words that predated human civilization, calling upon powers that had witnessed the original binding. The ancient stones of the chamber responded, their carved symbols flaring to life as they recognized the invocation of their creator's will. "It's working!" Alva gasped as the redirected energy began forming new crystalline structures around the entity's form. But the strain was enormous. Power meant to break cosmic barriers was being forced to serve opposite purposes, and the feedback was tearing her apart from within. Eirik felt the sundering blade growing hot in his hands as it channeled forces that threatened to overwhelm its ancient construction. The weapon had been forged to cut through supernatural bonds, not to forge them, and using it against its intended purpose was causing fundamental changes in its structure. The entity's rage manifested as psychic pressure that crushed down on their minds like the weight of mountains. Despair flooded through the chamber, not ordinary human sadness, but the cosmic grief of entropy itself, the inevitable sorrow that came with knowing all things must eventually end. "Fight it," Ragnhild commanded, her own voice strained to breaking as she maintained her protective chants. "Don't let it into your thoughts." But the assault was overwhelming. Leif stumbled, his sword arm wavering as visions of failure filled his mind. Astrid cried out as she saw images of everyone she loved aging and dying while she remained helpless to prevent their suffering. Only Eirik seemed able to resist the entity's mental assault, and gradually he realized why. The sundering blade wasn't just channeling power, it was sharing its memories, showing him glimpses of every time it had been used to preserve rather than destroy. The weapon had been present at the original binding, had witnessed the sacrifice of his ancestors, and through that connection, he could feel their strength flowing into him across the centuries. With that ancestral power sustaining him, Eirik drove the blade deeper into the control matrix, feeling the weapon's structure begin to fracture as it performed functions it was never designed for. But the sacrifice was working. New crystalline walls were forming around the entity, stronger and more complex than the original prison. The entity made one final desperate assault, throwing all its accumulated power against the forming bonds. The chamber shook as reality itself groaned under the strain. And for a moment it seemed that existence might simply collapse under the weight of forces too vast for any single dimension to contain. Then Alva screamed, not in pain, but in triumph, as the last connection snapped into place. The redirected ritual energy locked into its new configuration, creating a prison that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions, making escape impossible from any single realm. The entity's roar of rage and despair shook the mountain as it found itself bound more securely than ever before. But the victory came at enormous cost. The sundering blade shattered in Eirik's hands, its fragments dissolving into motes of light that scattered like dying stars. Alva collapsed, the Satyr Stone's light fading as its power was finally exhausted. Above them, Harald's ritual collapsed as the power he had been drawing upon was suddenly severed. His dark advisor shrieked as cosmic forces he could no longer control turned back upon him, reducing his physical form to ash, while his spirit was drawn screaming into dimensions where his kind belonged. The immediate crisis was over, but as Eirik knelt beside Alva's unconscious form, he realized their trials were far from ended. 3 months after the Battle of the Moonwell, as the settlement folk had begun calling it, Eirik stood once again on the shore of Ulfheim's harbour. The burned sections of Magnus's great hall had been rebuilt with timber that seemed to glow with inner warmth, and the Jarl's household had returned to something approaching normalcy. Yet beneath the surface of daily routine, everyone understood that the world had changed in ways that would echo through generations yet unborn. Harald Bloodaxe had survived the collapse of his ritual, though the experience had left him a broken man. Without his dark advisor's influence, the ambitious conqueror had become something closer to a confused elder, struggling to understand how his grand designs had led to such catastrophic failure. His forces had scattered, some returning to their home settlements, others choosing exile rather than facing questions about their role in what many now called the Night of Madness. Magnus approached Eirik as he watched the fishing boats return with their evening catch. Their familiar rhythms, a comfort after months of supernatural chaos. The messenger returned from the northern settlements, the Jarl reported. Eirik Haraldsson has been seen in the court of King Olaf, seeking forgiveness and claiming his father was corrupted by forces beyond mortal understanding. Eirik nodded without surprise. Men like Eirik possessed an instinct for survival that allowed them to adapt their stories to whatever circumstances demanded. And the king's response? Cautious acceptance, conditional on Eirik providing detailed accounts of everything he witnessed. It seems our young king is more interested in understanding what happened than in pursuing vengeance against those who may have been as much victims as villains. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The normal beauty of the scene felt almost miraculous after the cosmic horrors they had confronted beneath the mountain. Sometimes the greatest victories were measured not in dramatic transformations, but in the simple preservation of ordinary peace. Astrid emerged from the settlement's rebuilt heart, carrying a wooden tray laden with the kind of simple meal that had sustained their people through countless generations. Her movements carried the same practical grace they always had. Yet Eirik noticed new depths in her eyes, an awareness that came from having witnessed the thin membrane between normal life and unimaginable chaos. "How is she today?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from Astrid's expression. "Better, stronger. The connection to the old powers grows steadier each day, though she says it will never be what it was before the stone's destruction." Astrid settled beside them. Her presence, bringing the kind of comfort that came from shared trials, survived together. "She asks for you to visit when the evening meal is finished." Alva had spent weeks recovering from the strain of channeling forces that mortal bodies were never designed to contain. The loss of the Seder stone had severed her connection to the supernatural realm in ways that left her more human than she had ever been, yet also strangely more herself. Without the weight of cosmic responsibility, she had begun to discover who she might be when allowed to choose her own path. Ragnhild appeared as if summoned by the gathering dusk, her arrival marked by the subtle shift in atmosphere that always accompanied those who walked between worlds. The ancient seer had remained in Ulfheim during the aftermath, helping to interpret the changes that their victory had wrought in the fabric of reality itself. "The Northern Watchers report that the aurora has returned to natural patterns," she announced, settling among them with the easy familiarity that had developed through shared crisis. "The last traces of dimensional instability are fading, and the barriers between realms have strengthened beyond their pre-crisis levels." Leif joined their informal gathering, carrying news from his own travels to settlements throughout the region. "The strange dreams that plagued so many people through the summer have ended. Children sleep peacefully, and the old folk speak less of omens and portents." As darkness settled over the fjord, Eirik found himself reflecting on the price and meaning of their victory. The immediate threat had been contained, but at the cost of artifacts and powers that had protected these lands for generations. Yet perhaps that too was part of the natural order, each generation finding new ways to face the challenges that arose from the eternal tension between order and chaos. "What comes next?" Magnus asked, voicing the question that lingered in all their thoughts. "The old guardians are gone, the ancient treaties dissolved. How do we protect what we've preserved?" Ragnhild smiled with the wisdom of someone who had witnessed the turning of ages. "The same way your ancestors did, through courage, wisdom, and the understanding that some things are worth any sacrifice to protect. The forms change, but the essential struggle remains constant." She gestured toward the settlement where families were gathering for evening meals, where children learned the songs and stories that would carry their culture into the future, where ordinary people lived, ordinary lives made possible by extraordinary. sacrifices they would never fully comprehend. The real victory wasn't in defeating the entity or preserving cosmic balance, she continued. It was in proving that when faced with impossible choices, mortal hearts can rise to meet challenges that dwarf their understanding. That knowledge itself becomes a protection for future generations. As if summoned by their conversation, Alva appeared at the harbor's edge, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had found peace with circumstances beyond her control. The glow that had once marked her as something other than human was gone, yet her presence still carried the warmth of someone touched by forces larger than ordinary existence. "The new protections are holding," she reported, her voice carrying satisfaction earned through trial. "Different from what came before, but perhaps better suited to a world where the old certainties no longer apply." Eirik rose to meet her, taking her hand with the easy gesture of partnership forged through shared purpose. Together, they looked out over waters that reflected stars appearing in the deepening sky, the same stars that had witnessed the original binding, the same constellations that would watch over whatever trials and triumphs awaited in the years to come. Behind them, the rebuilt settlement hummed with the sounds of life continuing, conversations around hearthfires, children's laughter echoing through the streets, the rhythmic sounds of craftsmen preparing for tomorrow's work. It was a symphony of normalcy preserved through sacrifice, ordinary beauty protected by extraordinary courage. The aurora began to dance across the northern horizon, its natural patterns restored to the cycle of cosmic forces that had governed the world since its creation. In that gentle light, the past and future seemed to merge into a single moment of profound understanding, that the greatest victories were often measured not by what was gained, but by what was preserved for those who would come after. And in the years that followed, when children asked their grandparents about the night when fire rained from the sky and darkness walked the earth, the old ones would smile and speak of heroes who chose duty over safety, love over fear, and hope over despair. They would tell of a warrior who learned that true strength came not from conquest, but from protection, and a mysterious girl whose greatest magic was helping others discover the extraordinary potential that lived within ordinary hearts. The story would become legend, and legend would become the foundation upon which future generations built their own understanding of courage, sacrifice, and the eternal responsibility to stand guard against the darkness that always waits beyond the firelight.